I want to bring in my first guest. You all know her. So let's just bring her in. Here she is, Vanessa Beeley. Hello, Vanessa.
Hi, Sonia. Good morning and happy birthday to your mum, I believe.
Oh, thank you. You heard. Yeah. Oh, no, I'd already told you, hadn't I? I said I want you to come on this day. Absolutely. Thank you, darling. Thank you. My mummy in heaven. Yeah, she was a badass like us, Vanessa. Right. So yes, she was. Yes, she was. Vanessa, of course, is an independent journalist and she's worked extensively in the Middle East. And I just really wanted, I mean, so many people contact me, Vanessa, when I bring on people talking about the Middle East and they say, have you talked to Vanessa Beeley about this? And I'm like, no, but I will, I promise. And the most recent one was to do with Yemen. And obviously, you're the person, you know what's going. Please help us to understand. Take us away from the headlines. What's really taking place in Yemen at the moment? She's just frozen.
Well, under the Genocide Convention. Oh, am I frozen?
Mm-hmm.
Am I back? Okay. Basically, I think, to put it very simplistically, of course, Yemen has been at war since 2015. It's been under crippling siege and economic blockade on humanitarian relief, medical relief, and so on, under UN Resolution 2216, which is a completely illegitimate resolution. It targets 7 people, not the 34 million Yemenis that are suffering as a result of this resolution, which was created by the UN and is being exploited by Saudi Arabia and the US and so on, and the UK, to basically cripple Yemen. So that began in 2015, despite the UN peace envoy at the time, Jamal Ben Omar.
Frozen.
Saying, this is normal. This is what we see all the time, particularly in West Asia or the Middle East, as people know it, that the West just does what it wants, basically, and violates every single international law that has ever existed in order to cripple the region and prevent it being a threat to the security of their pariah state, Israel, that has been committing genocide against Palestinians for the last 100 years, but intensively since October the 7th. And so effectively what Yemen did collectively, not just some tribal faction called the Houthis, the entire movement, the resistance movement, which is known in the region as Ansarullah, the Party of God, which formed a coalition government constitutionally elected of a coalition of 38 political parties in Yemen. So it represents the majority of Yemenis, took the decision to basically stand with the Geneva Convention, Articles 1 and 2, I think it is, to prevent genocide and to punish those that are committing genocide, which we know is Israel against the Palestinians, but it's also expanding that genocidal activity into Lebanon and Syria as we speak. And so the Yemenis took the decision that what they could do is to prevent the shipping of weapons and equipment and supplies to the Zionists while they're carrying out the genocide by targeting shipping in the Red Sea. And so effectively what we now have is an escalation by President Trump that many of us warned would happen the minute that he was elected. And he's basically waging war against the Yemenis to sustain the genocide in Palestine. That is basically what's happening right now. It's not by America as proxies for Israel to prevent, continue the genocide against Palestinians.
Some of his social media posts are absolutely grotesque. He was doing a big hoo-ha. I think it was last week after they just bombed one building. This, I mean, like you say, we knew. No, you knew. People like you knew. People like me didn't necessarily know, although when it comes to Trump, I kind of did. But this must be so exasperating for you. How long have you been out there now covering all of this?
Really since 2012, when I was actually in Gaza during the Israeli aggression of 2012. I went back there in 2013, and then I got involved in the Syria case. I guess from 2013, 2014 onwards, I entered Syria for the first time in 2016, and was then covering the majority of the war from 2016 until, of course, I had to leave in December last year when finally the international coup was successful and imposed an Al-Qaeda junta government or regime in Damascus that is now conducting ethnic cleansing and another genocide inside Syria. It seems to be that Western governments in particular, whether it's the UK, the US, or EU member states, only seem able to sow violence, savagery, genocide, ethnic cleansing, while of course claiming that they're developing these countries that were perfectly developed, but are now of course regressing to the dark ages under the projects that are being run by the UK and the US in particular, but with their allies in Turkey, the Gulf states, and of course we can't forget Israel, for whose security the majority of these wars have been waged in the first place.
Talking about Israel, I don't think I've ever seen an administration like Trump's where so many people are prepared to actually say Israel first. Have you ever seen anything like it?
No, and again, this was something that, you know, many of us were warning about prior to the elections. And what we were being told is, look, Palestine's only one issue. And this is something that I really want to address, because if people think Israel is only one issue, they're forgetting who runs Israel, which is the entire global Zionist movement. And it's the Zionist movement which is embedded effectively in every single sector of society in the West. If you look at the UK 2030 Israel UK roadmap, it's a very sobering document. It shows that Israel, aka the spy units, the surveillance units that have been turning areas like Hebron and the occupied territories into a brutal smart city, basically, you know, with surveillance, but surveillance obviously that contains weapons and targeting equipment that can basically eliminate a Palestinian in a second. And these entities are now embedded in our societal structure in the West. And so when people say it's only one issue, this is completely erroneous, because this issue is going to have an effect on every single aspect of our lives and society now and in the future. And as Israel expands its power and basically destroys those countries that have stood in resistance against its ethnic cleansing, genocidal policies, then of course, what's it going to do? It's going to become one of the most powerful entities in the world, backed by the entire oligarchy complex in the US, UK, and EU. And it's going to basically be affecting all of us, not only the people here in the region. So we were arguing for this and saying that basically Trump's administration was packed full of Zionist supporters and also Christian Zionists, which is an oxymoron in itself, but nevertheless believers in this kind of end world doctrine that means that they have to bring about Armageddon in order to engender the second coming of Christ, which of course is entirely ridiculous in my opinion. I mean, you shouldn't be fast forwarding something that should happen naturally in a spiritual way, right? I mean, that's putting it very simply. Yeah. But effectively, that's what the Trump's administration is full of. And this is what we were saying. And people were simply, you know, sticking their fingers in their ears and still believing in the two-party paradigm, which doesn't exist anywhere, particularly in the UK. I mean, we don't have any difference anymore between Labour and Tory as regards their policies. And it's the same in the US. There's no difference. There's a roadmap that is designed by the deep state and the Pentagon and the ruling elite, transnational ruling elite. And each president has a role to play on that roadmap. And it's very clear what Trump's role is this time around.
I mean, I'm nowhere near as invested as you are. I think I'm on a very late catch up over the last 2 years where it's become apparent to me about how it's all linked up, right? It was never really my ball, right? But the more that I've looked, the more scary it's become. And when I saw, for example, that AI generated ad that Trump put out where he was like, you know the one I'm talking about, where he was taking over Gaza. Yeah. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, talk about God complex. It was extraordinary. But that literally made me feel physically sick. I cannot imagine how it would have impacted you out there on the front line. You are seeing the misery that is being caused to people, the devastation. What was your reaction when you saw that? Because I think there was a big statement in that.
You know, the depravity that is now on full display from the West. from the reports that have recently been published, even in Hebrew media, about the culture in Israeli society of pedophilia, of child abuse, of rape, of sexual harassment, of ritual and religious child abuse ceremonies where children are raped by family members, by relatives during religious ceremonies. I've actually published this report at my Substack, but I've written previously about the fact that Israel is a culture of pedophilia, right? And the fact that many rapists or pedophiles, for example, in the US, are they're converting to Judaism because they know that Israel is a haven for pedophiles. So they're converting to Judaism. This is documented. And then they're moving to Israel where they are protected.
There's an article, I've been reading it this morning. I think it's on your Substack, Israel's history of paedophilia. Now, obviously, the moment you say a statement like that, people are like, oh, this has got to be anti-Semitism and everything. We've got to be careful about that because obviously we see what's happening in America and we must not allow that to happen where literally students are being, arrested on the street and attempts to deport them under this guise of anti-Semitism simply because they're protesting genocide. But talk to us about this article, what you're talking about, Israel's history of pedophilia, because I think this all links up with the whole kind of Mossad, Epstein, and how many people are compromised, right? Talk to us.
Well, I mean, you only have to look, as I mentioned at the end of the article, which, as I said, was actually published in Israel Hayom. This was the one that I most recently published. I'd also written about Israel being a haven for pedophiles previously, and I included that in a link in the article that covered the Israel Hayom investigation. So this was an investigation by Hebrew press. It's not an investigation by me. It's not an investigation by anyone that can be accused of anti-Semitism, right? And basically what it reveals is that Israel, from north to south, east to west, has a culture of pedophilia, child abuse, both through educational institutions, through religious institutions, through every sector that a child should find safety and refuge within, right? These children have been abused, they've been raped, they've been basically under the religious ceremonial pretext, they've been told that if they don't allow themselves to be sacrificed, which means to be raped multiple times, then another child from their family will be taken. And the thing is that you can't look at this in isolation, because if you look at the rape of Palestinian prisoners by the Israeli military in prisons like State Yemen, for example, and the actual fact that rather than protesting the rape of Palestinian prisoners, there were protests to prevent the prosecution of the rapists and the sodomists, right? And there is ongoing history and documentation of rape and abuse of children, of organ theft, of abuse and humiliation, ritual abuse and humiliation of Palestinian prisoners, even medical staff. There's a doctor whose name escapes me right now, but he's been in prison for, I think it's around 2 months now. And another doctor who died as a result of the sodomy and the rape and the torture that was carried out against him. So it becomes clear that this is a culture that is not only indoctrinated with hate from a very young age. If you look at a film called Israelism, it will demonstrate very clearly that even from kindergarten, the children are indoctrinated with hate and dehumanization of Palestinians, right? But not only that, if they're then growing up in a culture of abuse, how many times does a victim of abuse become an abuser?
Right.
Or how is this abuse basically so pervasive in Israeli society that we see it being projected onto Palestinian prisoners that have already been dehumanized anyway? So in other words, they're ripe for this kind of abuse and perversion and depravity. But we also have to remember who created the Zionist entity, who created the Zionist movement. It was the British, right? And it was then adopted by the US. And even if you look at what Al-Qaeda, so-called HTS, is doing in Syria, it's very similar very similar tactics: rape, child trafficking, organ trafficking, and so on. And we have to look at the root of this, the origin. It comes from those who rule over us and govern over us, right? Because this wouldn't be allowed to happen without their endorsement.
Even as you're speaking, I'm seeing some people saying that they're having their comments removed by YouTube as they're literally typing in response to what you're saying, right? And that tells us so much, because what we have is like the so-called world's, richest man uses his platform to talk about all of the abuse that's happening in the UK, right? And obviously there is terrible abuse. I made a film called Pedophiles in Parliament. I know it, right? But they don't want to look at Israel, do they? And in fact, even what you're saying is so controversial, Vanessa. And as you say, it's nothing to do with me. I'm literally, this was said, right? I don't have a dog in this race, but it's so controversial what you're saying. I don't understand how we've got to this stage where to even question what's going on in Israel is so problematic.
Well, it's problematic because I think it was Robert F. Kennedy that said this very clearly before Trump was elected. And in fact, before Robert F. Kennedy Jr. became part of the campaign. But he said very clearly that the security of Israel is paramount. One, because it's a military outpost and bulwark for the US in the region. It provides surveillance, it provides interference, that was his words. But it also provides an obstacle to the expansion of, for example, Iran or of China with the Belt and Road Initiative. Because if we look at the India Middle East Economic Corridor, where does it cut through? It goes from Mumbai through the Gulf states into the occupied territories of Palestine, and then into Egypt, and then to Europe. So it's very clear that Israel per se, I don't think is important to the West. But what is important is Israel's position in West Asia, and its security effectively translates to the security of the US and the UK, and the US and the UK and the EU's interests in the region. And that means bringing all of, for example, the Sunni states, as they call them, the Sunni Islamic states, under the control of Israel in order to prevent any threat to the security and stability of Israel. And we've seen that with the Abraham Accords, which of course were initially brought in under the first Trump administration by his waterfront developer son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And that basically is trying to bring Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and Bahrain, all of those Gulf states not under the control, but under the normalization project with Israel. Egypt is already, in my opinion, the Ukraine of West Asia, because it's completely in hock to the IMF, to the EU, to Israel, and to the Gulf states. It has very little sovereignty left. Jordan is a weakened state. It's a vassal state of the British, actually. And it's going to do nothing to basically destabilize Israel, because it knows, and it's been threatened with the potential for destabilization of Jordan should it step out of line and should it cease to be an air defense base for the US and for Israel. So what remains? Syria now has effectively been broken as the land bridge between Iran, Iraq, and the resistance in Lebanon and Palestine. So and Israel is expanding now territorial gain into Syria, in the south of Syria, and it intends to extend up the eastern corridor towards Iraq. So, what we're now seeing at play is a war effectively against the entire resistance axis in order to secure the stability and security for Israel for the future, for the foreseeable future. That's why Syria's entire military capability was destroyed one day after December the 8th, when Damascus finally fell.
Let me read you this statement from Crafty King. She says, Israel is pivotal. When it falls, the whole deep state will collapse. Is it that pivotal?
Again, I would argue not necessarily Israel, because I think if Israel fell, and there is a very high risk that economically Israel might fail, that there might be a civil war between the very far right extremist factions in Israel and the Knesset, which I wouldn't describe as being left or center. It is still to the right, but it's not as far right as some of the other factions. And there is a war going on between certain factions, those two factions in Israel. But if Israel were to fall, as I've said, you still have the entire global Zionist movement, right? And they're not going to actually allow Israel to fall unless they need it to fall for a reason. And so I think what we should be doing is not separating Israel from that global Zionist movement. I mean, Professor David Miller is the one that I would recommend people go to actually read about the Zionist movement as opposed to the Zionist lobby and how powerful it is globally. And so I think we need to see the two together, not as separate entities.
Got you. And also it's important to remember that not all Zionists are Jewish and not all Jews are Zionists, right? I mean, that's, we have to separate that, because that's when it gets messy, because there's a whole load of people in Israel who are rising up against what's taking place, but we hardly ever get to hear from them, do we?
I think the ones that are potentially rising up are what are known as, rather derogatorily, the Mizrahi Jews, who were the actual original Jews that were there in the Middle East even before kind of 1917 and the Balfour Treaty, and when the European Jewish settlers started to enter Palestine. And those Jews are actually very much sort of discriminated against, not on a par with the Palestinians, but they are perceived as not being pure Jews by the kind of Ashkenazi Jews that settled in Israel, particularly post-1948. And so there are elements within Israel, but as Alistair Crook, who is former MI6 and worked in Israel for years, has said, probably 80 to 90% of Israelis' population want the genocide of Palestinians. So it's there's no longer a big divide between Israeli citizens, because, as they said, if we come back to the indoctrination that Israelis have from birth, you know, they're brought up to believe in this hatred and need for elimination of the Palestinian existence in what is perceived as their territory, their land.
And they, of course, would say the same happens in Palestine, that the Palestinian children are raised to hate them as well. How do you respond to that?
I lived in Gaza, or I stayed in Gaza, and I will tell one story. While I was there, in fact, the day after I arrived, there was a 13-year-old boy, Hamid Abu Daga, who was playing football outside his house after school. An Israeli helicopter in front of us came in and strafed him, killed him on sight. And I remember going to the funeral, attending the funeral, and when I came back in 2013, I went back to see the family. And I remember speaking to the father outside, and I said, "What would you do, or what would you say to the pilot that killed your son?" He had tears rolling down his cheeks. It still makes me kind of tear up when I think about it now. And he said, "I would just ask him, how? How could you kill a child? Do you not have children?" These children are not brought up to hate, Sonia. But what do you expect?
Right.
When they are literally burned alive, when they're raped, when they see their parents killed in front of them. It's not hatred. It's a need for justice. And it's a drive for resistance against what is a genocide. This is a completely, you know, if your family is being raped in front of you, your house is being burned, and your property is being taken from you, it's not hate. But this is, you know, it's wrong.
It's something
and
deep in the
therefore you
core
would
of
want to correct. Yes.
Yeah, I understand
but there's no hate. There's no hate. There's very little. If you go to Palestine. I do get that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about this week, because obviously it's a holy week for many people around the world. It's Easter. How does that kind of pan out over there? Because you talked about Christian Zionists before, but how does Easter work in the Middle East?
Exactly the same as anywhere else. In fact, if anything, the Christian communities are far stronger and far more integrated, particularly when I was living in Syria. Lebanon is a little bit different. It's a more of a kind of a sectarian state. So people are very much divided into their religious identity, much more than in Syria. In Syria, it was a nation state. I'm saying was, because I don't believe it is right now, as a result of what's gone on there since December last year. But in Syria, the Christians and the Muslims and all the other minority sects were completely integrated and shared their cultural festivals and celebrations quite happily. Here, it's very much it's similar, but as I said, they're more separated. So here, everyone celebrated Palm Sunday yesterday. It is Monday today, right? Yes.
It is Monday.
And I'm losing track. But it's still, the problem in the region is part of the Western agenda is to drive the Christians out of the region. And that's another aspect which is very important, because effectively they want the Christians gone, because the Christians act as a sort of a buffer between the Sunni and Shia Muslims, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, it does.
So they want the Christians gone. So they've created environments in which the Christians feel threatened, as they are now in Syria, and they were previously since 2011 under the regime change war, when the terrorist factions, proxies of the UK and the US, were targeting Christian communities. Many of them already left. And now we're back in a similar situation in Syria, where they're again under threat of ethnic cleansing.
So just circular
and persecution.
Keep going round and round. It's awful, awful. One quick question before you go. Sean Parker says, does Vanessa think British lawyers are right to push for Hamas to be delisted as terrorists in the UK? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, they are. And Hezbollah should be de-prescribed also. It's ridiculous. What threat are Hamas and Hezbollah to the UK? They're not. They're a threat to Israelis and to Israel's national security. That's why they're being prescribed a terrorist group by the UK. It has nothing to do with the UK's national security. This is protection of Israel. And I raise the question, who do we in the UK or you in the UK represent the government? Does it represent UK interests, or does it represent Israeli interests? And to what extent do Israeli interests override British interests? And I think that's what every British citizen should be looking at.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning. You're an absolute powerhouse, everybody. This is indeed Vanessa Beeley. You heard her. Yes, you did. Take good care of yourself, Vanessa. Have a good day, darling. Lovely to have you with us.
Thanks,
Vanessa
Sonia.
Beeley. Wonderful. She's so powerful. The thing is, it's authentic. What she cares about what she's covering. And I meet a lot of journalists, but there are very few like Vanessa Beeley, because it matters to her. It absolutely matters to her. And yes, we are an open house here. If you disagree with her, tell me so. Tell me so, people. Peter says she's brilliant as always. Brilliant as always.
It's time to wake up with Sonia Poulton.